There we go. We're live. Okay. Welcome. We have Dr. Lindsay with us again today, following up from last week and probably many more weeks yet to come because who knows when life returns to normal. And today we are going to be talking about diet and obesity, and not just about the calorie value that we eat. Everybody thinks if I eat too much, I get fat, but understanding how so many of the foods we eat have an effect on inflammation in our body, and it changes the way our chemistry operates so that we can have massive differences in our body. This is something that's been, as you and I were just chatting about, this has been near and dear to me for a very long time. And I'm really glad and grateful to have an absolute expert in the field sharing more and more knowledge with us.
Awesome. Yeah, I look forward to it. Naturopathic medicine, we're obsessed with diet and digestion. So it's definitely an area that we spend a lot of time with our patients on. And also because it's just so crucial to how people are going to do long term. I mean, not just from like a weight perspective, but immune system. I mean, diabetes is such a huge, it's an epidemic right now.
Yeah.
And that affects so many areas of people's lives, and just the medication people have to be on. Cardiovascular disease. I mean, I see so many patients coming in having to go on blood pressure medication. It's pretty much, not to be sexist, but almost every male.
It's true.
They're being put on blood pressure and cholesterol medication. And that's not a good long-term strategy if you can avoid it. Weight loss makes a huge difference for blood pressure, which is so cool. I mean, you lose 30 pounds, your blood pressure goes down.
Yeah.
I mean, that's like kind of the ultimate in preventative medicine. It's you don't need the medication. You can work with diet and lifestyle. So yeah, it's definitely an area that I'm very interested in. Definitely.
Yeah. No, I'm looking forward to it. I mean, this is so much of what I talk about and I counsel my patients with too. Like my shtick, my jam is sleep apnea. And so when you're dealing with people who have sleep problems, one of the first things you got to do is if you can get their weight back down, get their diet shifted to be, so you have more of an anti-inflammatory kind of diet as opposed to a very pro-inflammatory diet. I've seen parents literally cure their children's sleep apnea problems simply by cutting out all sugar, processed foods, and they'll come back 6 months later and their kids are just, they're normal kids again.
Yeah, it's so important. And I think diet kind of gets pushed to the side, especially a lot in Western medicine, because it's not a medication and it does take a bit of effort. Like lifestyle medicine can be a bit challenging for some people, but it can be so, like the rewards that you yield from it are so much more than medication or even sometimes supplements can do.
Yeah.
So yeah, I mean, I guess it just depends where you want to start with this. Like as far as the whole like anti-inflammatory piece, this is a huge piece as far as like the type of foods that we're eating, kind of like we talked about last week about trying to eat whole foods as much as you can.
Yeah.
Because I mean, over consuming sugar, called like the empty calories, but most people know they don't feel great after they have a lot of sugar and you're hungry again right away. And it goes back to also what we were saying last week about fiber. I mean, if you can eat a high fiber diet, you do feel more full and you can eat more volume of food. So you're not left starving half an hour later wanting to eat more. And that's where we get ourselves into a lot of trouble. And all the convenience foods. And it's just so easy right now.
Would you say it's a reasonable starting point, like as we go into this conversation further, to think about that whole idea of where diet sits and how it relates with inflammation is really a starting point for understanding how diet begins to affect physiology in the body and overall well-being?
Definitely. I mean, food is our fuel. It literally affects us on a biochemical level, right? Yeah. And so you can look at it that way. I mean, you can really kind of just make it from like a science perspective. It's like everything we're putting in, every molecule we're putting in is affecting our body in a certain way. So whether it be a fat or a protein or a sugar or a chemical, I mean, everything influences us. So we can really start looking at it that way. I don't tend to really take it down like you were saying about, counting calories or things like that. Like I don't tend to kind of go to that level so much with most patients. Some people we do.
Yes, because now you're right.
Well, yeah. Some people they need that sometimes as kind of like a framework to see like where they're overeating. Yeah. But in general, I mean, we know people can lose weight. I mean, weight loss itself is actually not the hardest thing. It's weight maintenance for most people. And that's where kind of looking at this like as just like a whole lifestyle overhaul. It's not so much about, really restricting things and saying you can only have this or you can only have that. And you have to count your calories, no more than 1,500 calories a day, problem solved. I mean, if it was that easy, we wouldn't have the issue that we have in our country and in most countries in the world right now with obesity. So for most people, we just start with just talking about like what are good food choices for them. And that will depend on the person, like their age, their metabolism. I mean, if we want to get into the biochemical piece too, like if we have done some genetic work or things like that, like areas they need to be working on to support them. Minerals are really important because that can play a big role in like blood sugar and how your body's dealing with that too. And most people tend to be deficient in certain minerals right now. We were talking about zinc last week.
Yeah.
I mean, zinc's a big one, and we need that. We need zinc for hormone metabolism. So if your hormones are wonky, well, guess what? Your appetite and your diet will be a bit wonky too. Yeah. It's all interrelated.
So if we start with that point, like we're kind of saying that inflammation is a good starting point. It's not the whole conversation, but it's a good starting point. Yeah. Maybe there's two different ways we can look at this. As one, there's going to be the foods that promote inflammation, and then there's also going to be the foods that will help to decrease inflammation.
Yes.
And then when we understand those two things, we can start saying, okay, well, if I avoid inflammation reducers, so why don't we start with that part of it then? What are some of the most common foods in our diet that are going to promote inflammation, which then increases cortisol? And much of the basis of this conversation, largely not just the food part, is that as we increase serotonin, decrease cortisol, that's really one of the key foundations to overall well-being. So what are some of the foods then that cause inflammation that are really common in our diets?
Yeah, well, sugar, alcohol, a lot of like the white flour, like processed things, if that's kind of all you're eating. Because sometimes you can eat some of those foods along with healthier versions of it, and it's going to be okay. It's going to balance out a little bit better. But it really is quite simple as far as like just really the processed foods are not doing us a lot of good things. We can go into things like even excess red meat. This gets into some more philosophical debates around, what is the best diet for people. Some people don't like to hear that cutting down on red meat may be a good idea, but we definitely see that influencing some of the inflammatory markers in the body. So, again, it depends on the person. If you're completely healthy and your stress levels are good and you're sleeping well and you're a good weight, you can manage a lot of these things. Your body can deal with it a lot better. If you're diabetic and 100 pounds overweight and your blood pressure issues and you're very inflamed, we may want to put you on a more strict diet. I don't like the word diet, but really focus on maybe have red meat once a week if you're going to have red meat. And, focus on, fish is very anti-inflammatory. Unfortunately, with fish, we've contaminated a lot of our fish now. Yeah. So if you're going to eat fish, I would look for just Alaskan or Pacific salmon, to be honest. Other fish are pretty contaminated with mercury and even things like PCBs and all the other stuff. It's rampant. Even if you're fishing from your local lake now, they've found it everywhere. It's every waterway. They've researched this in the States. Everything's contaminated now. So the Pacific Ocean, just because it's bigger, and at the northern kind of part of it, that does have the least contaminated fish.
Okay.
So, and of course, avoiding farmed fish because that is not actually anti-inflammatory.
Yep.
So that presents another issue around cost because wild Alaskan or Pacific salmon is going to cost you quite a bit. So again, that's probably not something you can have every day, but incorporating that in your diet. And then going mostly plant-based, which I know can be a bit of a controversy for some people, but that does seem to give the most benefits for people long-term.
Okay.
Yeah.
So so you're saying sugar is the big thing we got to avoid.
Processed sugar, I should say.
Processed sugar,
yes.
Processed foods in general. Are again, there's for all whole bunch of biochemical reasons are again going to create a lot more inflammation, and then we have that swelling in our body. Again, we have higher cortisol. Now we want to pack on extra adipose and fat around our body, around our middle. So then we tend to gain weight just because of how we're affecting the biochemistry of our body.
Totally.
So then, what are some of the things we've talked about? Fish is good things to go towards. More plant-based is good things to go towards. Yeah. How about the whole talk about fat? I mean, this was such a big topic maybe 20 years ago.
Yeah.
And maybe just a little bit before you were in my time, but I still see so much of the effects and the ripple coming through even our generation.
Yes.
Speak a little bit to the fat, because like there's a whole idea of good fats, bad fats.
Yeah. Oh, I think you've got kicked off, but I'm going to keep speaking because it says it's live. So yeah, I mean, fat's really interesting because,
yeah,
there you are. Okay.
Okay. Now, remember, you got to make fun of me now because Angela's not here to make fun of me.
Yeah, like, fat's really interesting because there is still a bit of a controversy as far as, where we want to be going with that. We do know things like the omega-3 from fish. There's been enough evidence that that is anti-inflammatory and important, versus we know things like trans fat or deep fried fats are definitely not good for our body. That's kind of the really obvious ones.
Yeah.
I am a big proponent of fat. I like more plant-based fats, so things like nuts and seeds and avocado. I mean, those things, you can't really go wrong with that. We don't see, I mean, we can go, we could see consequences. You could gain weight if you're having too many of those foods because they're high calorie, but they're also very satiating. And because I see patients all the time wanting to lose weight, obviously, because that's like most of us, trying different diets and seeing how that works for them. And if you go on a fat-free diet, it's just not sustainable. And it creates so many other issues. And we can even get into like the mental issues that people start getting when they're not getting enough of the good fats. It could create a lot of problems for them, and they just won't feel well. And that's, I think, where some of the comments people make about, oh, vegans aren't healthy or they don't look well, or, people going really high carb, even if it's all complex carbs, and avoiding things like the fats. I just don't think long-term it's a good idea. There's so many different diets out there right now, like whether it's the keto diet or, low carb or high fat or whatever, paleo, whatever one you want to use. A lot of those long-term aren't really going to be a great idea. They can be really good in the short term to help train the body, or if you're having a massive metabolic issue or for certain health concerns. But truly, if you look at who does well long-term, and even if you look at the research into societies that actually are living longer and doing well, they have a pretty moderate diet. I mean, they're not really going crazy and just eating all fat or just eating all carbs. They're eating unprocessed food, they're eating a variety of food, and they're incorporating all the different like fat, protein, and carbs. They're not cutting anything out. And we do see issues with that long term when people go really extreme.
So on fats, I guess there's two things. One is that I've heard this, and I'd like you to speak to it a little bit about how when you've eaten fats, you feel full for longer, and it does something that, I don't know if you could say, tricks your brain into thinking that you've got the energy you need. So maybe if you could unpack that for us a little bit. And the second one that you alluded to that I'm really curious about is you talked about there's mental consequence of having good amounts of fats too. And I'm really curious to hear you speak about that a little bit more too.
Yes, definitely. So with the fat and being satiating, there's just a lot about how we actually process food when it gets into our body. And fat takes a little bit longer to process. And there is some biochemical pathways there that make it so it is something that's going to make us feel a bit better, because especially when you are overweight, there are certain chemicals that get released that tell your body to keep eating because your fat cells want to keep you eating. This is why weight loss can be so hard, because you have to be at a deficit to lose weight. And if you're at a deficit and you feel like you're starving, it's a long, hard road for people. So this is why if we encourage getting a good amount of the good oils and the good fats, along with high fiber foods, you're getting enough bulk so your stomach feels like it's full because it's getting enough. Because if you eat a croissant, by the time it gets to your stomach, there's not a whole lot there. Right?
Yeah, but it's still yum, 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 yum while I'm eating it.
It's very tasty, of course. And you're getting a lot of calories, but you're probably going to be hungry literally probably minutes, if not an hour later. Whereas if you're having, again, more bulk, things that take your body a little bit longer to digest, and the fats, which kind of slow that down. And fat also slows down that insulin response too. So does protein. And that's why it's nice to eat those in combination. You're not going to get that quick spike of insulin, which then causes your body to produce things that are going to make you want to eat again right away, that you can make that process so much easier on yourself. Yeah.
So that's spiking. That's what I've always understood as glycemic index. Is that correct?
Yeah.
So is that something that you talk about then a lot with your clients, or?
I do, but again, I find it can get very convoluted very quickly, and people start getting stressed out, and they start looking at all these like glycemic index lists, and they start saying, "Oh, I can't have sweet potato because it's too high on this," or "I can't have fruit." And I think most of us know if we're sitting down to eat a meal, if it's a good meal or not, right? And I think in general for people, I mean, we should be trying to have, complex carbohydrates with our meals. So that can be things like vegetables. It could be whole grains as well. Again, depending on what's going on with your gut and, like, again, how strictly we're trying to change things for you. But for most people, having something like quinoa or brown rice, or some other kind of like whole grain like that, along with having vegetables, and some kind of protein, whether that be beans or lentils or meat, we know that that's a good meal for us, and it feels good, and it sustains us for a good amount of time. So I mostly talk to people about the different types, like just like the unprocessed food. And like I said, I also try to avoid talking about all the things they should cut out. I like to talk more about what they can add in.
Okay.
Because that's a little less scary. Like if I tell someone, you can't have this, you can't have that, you can't have that, you can't have that, it just gets to be like psychologically a little bit challenging. If I say, okay, I want you to have 6 servings of vegetables today to start. Just that's all I want you to focus on, is having 6 servings of vegetables. I don't even care what else you do. If you start adding those things in, like, drinking more water, making sure that you're getting good fat. So maybe it's like, okay, I want you to have half an avocado today. I want you to make sure you're getting olive oil in your diet today. By the time they are done focusing on that, it doesn't leave as much room for the other stuff.
Right.
And mentally, it's a lot easier to work with because it's not a restriction. It's like, no, I want you to eat this. So go and find this food and eat this. So that can be a little bit easier.
So what do you think is, like, we all have some sense of an intuitive knowing what's good for us and what's not good for us. Mm-hmm. And yet we choose oftentimes to eat things that are not so good. What do you think's underlying that? And how do you counsel your clients to begin to make the shift?
So it's interesting because when I first start talking about weight loss with most people, I get into food a bit, but I actually talk about stress more than anything else, because I think for most people, it's the pace at which I would say we are living our life. Although right now, I think it's a little bit different.
But right now we're all stressed like nobody's business.
That's right.
For a completely different reason.
Totally. So it's really interesting that things have shifted, but stress stays there.
Yes.
I mean, stress is everything. It is. I mean, this is a whole other topic by itself. When you're stressed, you were talking about cortisol. It sounds like you know a bit about this. We release these hormones in our body, and our body thinks something horrible is happening. And traditionally for humans, if something bad is happening, it usually includes starvation. So the body is like, pack it on, store it in, because we might be starving for the next 3 months. So, we're the survivors. We're the ones that could pack it on, right? we're excellent. We lived through the famines, us, right?
Apparently,
yeah. So, we're very lucky that we have access to food all the time, most of us. But the downside is all these chronic illnesses and inflammation that we're seeing because we're eating too frequently, the wrong food choices. And then on top of that, the stress, because that puts a whole other piece into what's happening biochemically and where our body wants to store weight, especially around the middle when there's that cortisol piece.
Yeah.
And again, it's like we're going against our own wiring. It's like our bodies are smart. They think, man, if you're this stressed, you better eat all that, because that might be your last chance. And so this is really starting to cause a lot of massive health issues. So working on stress is fundamental. And I would say for the majority of my patients, until we work on the adrenal and the whole endocrine system, to be honest. So that includes your thyroid, your adrenal glands, which are your stress glands, and your hormones. Until we get that balanced, again, the weight loss process can be very, very challenging because you're just constantly fighting your own biochemistry, right?
And whether we're actually going into weight loss right now, my concern is, and I look at, we're all sitting at home with full fridges of food that maybe isn't as good for us. So we're not active, we are stressed. So we're going to eat.
Exactly.
Even if we're not looking to lose weight right now, I think just the reason why I think this conversation, I'm so glad to have you here, is to make sure bringing awareness to what should we be eating right now while we're stuck at home, while we are stressed, and while our minds are already clearly in this could be the last meal I eat because I don't even know if there's anything at the grocery store tomorrow.
Totally.
That's true or not. That's obviously the thought that's going through many of our minds. Of course. When you see that it takes 2 weeks to order something from Superstore, or you walk into Save On Foods and there's huge amounts of the grocery store that are empty.
Totally.
It does trigger that way of thinking, which doesn't help. So you talk a lot about stress reduction as being a very important first step of anything you're going to do with your clients.
Yes.
What are some of the most important and most powerful stress reduction techniques or recommendations that you make that you see the biggest yields that help people out?
Yes. Well, mindfulness is something most people have heard about now, but having some kind of a practice to work on what's happening in your mind, because we can create all sorts of issues for ourselves. And that does actually start a chemical cascade. I mean, again, nothing has to be happening externally. We can sit here and create a catastrophe in our own body, and that will release cortisol and create all these problems that we're having. So I think having some kind of a mindfulness practice, and so for some people, like, going out for a walk, just a nice calm walk can be helpful. Yoga, meditation, anything that works. Some people even praying, like, it doesn't really matter what that is for you. It just has to be something that, brings you back to yourself and brings you back to feeling grounded, like here.
Yeah.
Is huge, because that goes into even how we're breathing and how breathing affects, our vagus nerve and our stress response. So even just simply deep breathing, like, it doesn't have to be a fancy technique. Just sitting for 10 minutes and just focusing on breathing in and breathing out, we actually know that reduces cortisol, which is really cool.
Mm-hmm.
And so I, first of all, want people to have something that they know is helpful for them for stress reduction, and to try and commit to do that every day. Because moving your body is so important for stress too, if you can incorporate both of those. But for some people, they want to go run like a quick 5K run because it helps with stress. And that's true. It can help with anxiety and help bring down some of those other chemicals that are happening in the body. But for a lot of people, while they're running, their minds are still going, and they're super stressed. So that's actually not necessarily the right thing for what I'm talking about.
Okay.
I want people to get into that parasympathetic mode, right? So the opposite of fight or flight. It's the mode that we should be in when we're eating, which is interesting. Because if we are in that sympathetic or fight or flight mode, our body, again, is taking blood flow away from our internal organs because it thinks we're going to need to run. So we're not even digesting our food properly. So it goes down a whole other pathway. So whatever technique or thing that you can do that puts you into that kind of calm parasympathetic mode, you should be doing that before you eat. And you should be doing that throughout the day, especially now. Because most people find if you actually get into that state that you probably aren't going to want to run to the fridge and grab something, have a glass of water instead, or, sit with your discomfort, sit with your stress, and just instead of trying to run away from it all the time.
Yeah.
Which I think is interesting right now because people are having a harder time running away, and we're seeing the consequence of that. They're not going out and buying all this stuff, maybe online still, but, just really learning to be with yourself and be with that discomfort is kind of like the first thing that I would suggest to people. And then we can get into, there are a lot of different supplements and supportive things. Some like magnesium, people know a lot about magnesium. It can be very relaxing. It's actually really important for the adrenals and for the stress response. So it's a really safe one that you can even use if you're having trouble sleeping at night.
Okay.
So that's a really easy one that people can do. Vitamin C, the B vitamins, those are also crucial for adrenal function and for stress in your body. We burn through a lot of B vitamins when we're stressed out. So that's why we do a lot of things like B shots in the clinic. Because people, when they get stressed, they actually are using up more of that. That's the pathway gets utilized a lot more. And so you actually need a little bit more of that. So that can be really interesting. And then there's a lot of herbal things. You may have heard of adaptogens, like things like ashwagandha, rhodiola, schizandra, ginseng. Herbs that we know are very balancing to cortisol levels. That can be helpful, again, when we're in a more acute situation and we're trying to work on the mindfulness, we're trying to work on eating and sleep and exercise, but we're still dealing with anxiety or stress.
Okay.
It can be good to try some of those as well.
So those are, I've heard you say 4 different things. You talked about mindfulness, physical movement, supplements, adaptogens as being important, different techniques and strategies that can help us reduce our overall stress levels.
Yeah, definitely.
Anything else you want to add to that list that would be really helpful?
I think this whole COVID-19 situation has also highlighted a huge issue. Prior to this, if you would have talked to me, I would have said to you, like, mental health is such a huge issue right now, that this is just creating more issues around like the lack of connection people feel and maybe even the lack of purpose. And that creates a lot of stress in people. And so if you, especially the people that are home by themselves, like I have patients, elderly patients by themselves, have not seen another person for 2 to 3 weeks. So food can be like their friend, right? Food is like, is something that is bringing them a bit of like joy and satisfaction. And there's nothing wrong with that, but instead we want people to connect to something else. So whatever that is for them, whether it's like, again, like an online yoga class, or connecting to someone that they trust, like on the phone or through something like this where they can see the person and, talk through what they're going through.
Right.
Versus, again, like running to, well, food or alcohol, right? Those are two things we're seeing a lot right now. So, yeah.
I hear you. There's one other thing that you've alluded to a few times, and I'd like you to go into a little bit further, is water.
Yeah.
And how water begins to affect the body and what that does to our mental state.
Yeah, well, hydration is really important. Dehydration is actually a stressor on the body. So some people don't realize that,
Okay,
but
there we go.
exactly. And so you may have heard this, people talk about this a lot. Maybe you're not hungry, maybe you're actually thirsty. So, have some water
that
first. Yeah. And it's true for a lot of people. This is actually a huge weight loss tip that a lot of trainers and people that this is what they do. They always talk about this: drink way more water. If you're drinking, 3 to 4 liters of water a day, which is a lot, that's a lot of water. I mean, that'll also make you feel a little bit more full as well, right? And more satiated.
How long does it take people's bladders to get used to that much water?
Yeah. Well, and I'm not saying everyone should necessarily drink that amount of water. I mean, if you're going out and exercising a lot and we're in a drier climate here, and if it's warmer out, then that may be very appropriate. But even for most of my patients, I just get them to start thinking about drinking at least 2 liters of water a day.
Okay.
And what I say is, so I mean, a liter of water is not that much, it's like maybe, like that much water. If you think about it, if you're up for 16 hours a day, that means if you're going to be drinking 2 liters of water, it's a liter in 8 hours. So if you're slowly sipping on water, you're not going to have the bladder issues. What happens to most people is they get so busy during the day, so their cortisol levels up, they're ignoring their body, and then they wake up at 4 p.m. and they haven't drank water. Not wake up literally, but you know what I mean? Like realize they have a body and start chugging water. And then you're going to, of course, it's just most of it's going to run right through you because it's just too much at once. So I encourage constantly sipping on water throughout the day to help with the weight loss, to help with stress, believe it or not, and just to stay hydrated. Yeah.
So if we went through a lot of stuff here in the last 25 minutes, let's try to distill it down to say 3 or 4 key takeaways that you'd suggest to everybody's listening for great stress reductions, because we're all facing so much stress, everything that's going on right now. The uncertainty drives stress. So what are those 3 or 4 key takeaways that you would suggest? And
around the stress piece?
Yeah, around the stress. The takeaways that they do this, and this will really help to bring your stress levels down. Totally.
Like I said, I think really sitting with yourself for a bit and thinking about what it is that brings calm to your body, and this having one practice, like I said, whether it's deep breathing or yoga or meditation, finding something like that and then just making it a practice, like doing it before you go to bed if you're having trouble sleeping.
Yeah.
Because that's going to make a big difference. So that would be probably my number one. I think if people are really struggling with stress, it may be beneficial to do like a B complex or take an adaptogenic herb, something like ashwagandha, which is very safe to take because it just kind of balances things out. And then I would say food as well, like just keep it simple. You don't have to have fancy meals, but just look for, basic foods, like have rice with chicken and vegetables, if that's what you're going to have. I mean, that's a good meal and it's easy to prepare, and that'll make you feel pretty good and sustain you for a few hours at least.
So, one of the hard things for me as I started to get into eating healthier and healthier was, how do I make my food taste good?
Yeah.
Do you have like a website with some like recipes or something that we can like, okay, let's make some really yummy, tasty food still. Yeah. That's also good for me.
So I'm a little biased because I'm vegetarian, so I know that doesn't sit well with everybody, and I don't tell people they should be vegetarian. For me, though, there's so many great blogs out there, like She Glows, if you've heard of that website. She has fantastic, like breakfast, lunch, dinner. So it's vegetarian, so it's mostly like gluten-free, dairy-free, but some really simple recipes that taste really good. I just think getting familiar with a few different spices can make a huge difference. I mean, even things like garlic and just different like salts and different seasonings, oregano, turmeric, like curries are so tasty. And they're so helpful. And especially right now that it's still quite cold out, curries are easy to make. You can make a large batch. You can put a lot of good stuff in and they taste really, really good. I think again, just finding a few cookbooks or a few websites, like look online. There are a million resources. I can try to put something together and just like write down a few resources for you if you'd like.
Yeah, that'd be great. We can share them next time. Because I think like, if everybody understands that a big part of what I'm hearing you say is increase your vegetables.
Yeah.
Forget about trying to like remove.
Oh, you froze again.
Froze. There we go. I'm back. So if we take the focus of try to add to your diet more vegetables as opposed to subtract all of the other stuff.
Exactly.
Then if we could figure out we're not saying take away the meat, but if you could find ways to make your veggies taste better, you probably want to eat more of them anyway.
Totally.
So add more veggies.
Yes.
Drink more water. Develop some sort of a mindfulness practice.
Yes.
Get some B complex vitamins going on right now.
Yes.
And those 4 practices would really help to decrease stress.
Huge. And I'll just say really quick with the vegetables, baking vegetables in just like olive oil or coconut oil and adding like lemon after, not when it's baking, afterwards. So it maintains the lemon flavor. Things like herbamar or just garlic, it tastes so good, in my opinion. I think they're fantastic. But
well, let's make that the challenge. Just try it. Try some of those things. See if it tastes good. And if it doesn't, try something different.
Yes. And actually our clinic put together a few of our favorite recipes, so I can send that to you.
That'd be perfect.
Things that we've tried. And I don't think they're all vegetarian, but they're all really good. There's so many great recipes out there. Yeah.
Perfect. Well, I think we can start to wrap it up here. Do you have any last thoughts that you want to share with everybody before next week? We're going to have you back on. We're going to talk about food as it relates to mental health. Yeah. And I'm glad that we got it because this sets the frame to understand a lot more of what we're going to get into next week. Mm-hmm. But as we wrap up this week in food and stress specifically, do you have any last minute thoughts you want to share with everybody?
Yeah, I think for people, I think it's worth spending a little bit of time on this. It doesn't have to be a lot, but just thinking about what you are eating throughout the day. And if you're getting enough vegetables, if you're getting enough nutrients from your food, what the balance looks like. Just basically, it doesn't have to be like writing it down, but, do your meals look like good, balanced meals moving throughout the day? And how may that be affecting you? Like if you're not having a good lunch and you're crashing at 3 o'clock, well, maybe it's time to look at, what you're eating or not eating.
Yeah.
So I would just say that. Yeah.
Perfect. Well, thank you so much for joining us. It's always a pleasure to chat with you.
Yes, you're welcome.
And I'm really looking forward to connecting with you again next Friday.
Sounds good.
Have a great weekend.
Okay.
All right.
Bye.
Bye.